Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Satterfield. I really appreciate you all coming to listen to this talk. Before we get into what the talk's about, I definitely would like to, say a big thanks to my good friends over at Katalon for partnering with me on this, as well as the Pacific Northwest Conference. Really appreciate this opportunity. It's my first time speaking at this conference, and see a lot of really amazing talks going on, and as well as some great sessions here. So look forward to further participating here, as well as hopefully getting a chance to meet you all during the Q&A. So this talk is going over test automation strategy. I know normally it could be a pretty dry topic, but really been working with some testers in the industry to understand how to create an overall all-encompassing test strategy. And one of the questions that keep coming up was, what happens if we don't have a test automation strategy, as well as how do we create a specific test automation strategy? So, that was really where this talk was born. And I hope you all find it informative. And with that, let's kick right into the presentation here. All right. Come on, let's be better than Murphy's Law today of what could go wrong. Probably will. Excellent. Looks like we are up and running. So as I said, Adam Satterfield, we're going to talk about how to design and implement a best-in-class test automation strategy. So a little bit about me. I'm a child father and a dog father. You may hear some noise in the background, potentially. No guarantees whether that will be the child or the dog, or if not both. Definitely a gamer. You can see all my accoutrements in the background, and a lover of coffee. This is not sponsored by Death Wish Coffee. However, if you do wish to sponsor me, and for some reason you're listening to this conference, my information is at the end there. All right, the agenda. So we're going to go a little bit over, what is a strategy, some various pieces about what a strategy is, some bits that go in it and potentially what could go wrong. We're going to talk specifically about a test automation strategy. It's why we're all here to begin with, as well as some specific steps that we've used in the past, and I've worked with teams to implement on how to create the test strategy. And then we're going to kind of wind up talking about how it all ties in together. So let's keep going. So let's just get the definition out of the way first. What is a strategy? A strategy is a plan of action designed to achieve an overall aim. If we think about what the goal of testing is the drive to deliver quality to someone who matters. We combine that with strategy. Essentially, you have a plan of action for trying to figure out how you get to that level of quality for your customers, or for your person who is responsible for viewing the product or using the product. So we kind of see how a strategy will essentially have you be able to create that plan of action. So with that in mind, like what are some things that could potentially go wrong if we don't have a testing strategy? And this is one I would definitely love to hear some of your stories in the Q&A and the comments about what you've potentially seen gone wrong as well. So one of the first things is a true inability to show business value. And really what this means is a lot of times when we look to implement a brand new test automation solution, or potentially another solution like a performance testing or browser-based testing solution, we don't take the time up front to really plan out what is the business reason for why we're doing this. Yes, it may be cool tech. Yes, it may be something that we think is awesome. It will potentially help the business. But if we don't take that time to really kind of define and tie that into business value, what we see in the industry is a lot of these automation projects wind up being canceled because there is no value when the business looks and says, we're spending this amount of money and we're not getting that much out of it. So this is definitely one of the top things we see in terms of failures when we don't have a testing strategy. The next is, without that goal, without that plan of action, it's really tough to set your lack of vision. So as we go down, we see this with a lot of automation projects. As they start being implemented, a lot of times there's a pivot or a change of either needing to bring in a brand new application to automate as part of your framework, or potentially to switch the framework technology itself. And if we don't know what our original vision was that was tied to that ROI, it's really easy to say, well, let's just go ahead and scrap it, and maybe we can try something else down the road. Or we get 8 months or several years down the road and we look back and say, well, we really didn't accomplish that much because we were continually moving back and forth, and we didn't have a vision that we were able to really kind of go forward with to say, should we make this change? Does it make sense for our business value as well as our vision? If we don't have that documented, it's really hard to answer that question. This one we definitely see quite a bit. We call it technology efficiency loss. And this normally comes about from where we have an idea where we want to have an automation solution. And we decide, we kind of do, a Google search, and we're like, great, okay, well, we've got Selenium, right? So let's go ahead and just implement that. Well, who's going to write those scripts? Who is going to support that? Does Selenium make sense for the type of technology you're testing against? Is your application more of an API application? Does Selenium still make sense? And if you don't take the time to really write that down and have a strategy around that, what you wind up in the end is you wind up trying to, shoehorn or cram a technology into a solution that it should not be being used for. So you really want to make sure, again, Sorrow starts with that business value that helps you understand what you're trying to, accomplish from a financial or impact standpoint. It helps you understand your lack of your vision itself. And then, combined with, understanding your technology, you start to build this nice little picture of, what, the reasons why we want a testing strategy and the reasons why a testing strategy is so important. Which really kind of takes us down to, one of the biggest things that we always see. Of course, none of us have ever seen this testing squeeze. It never happens at the end of a sprint or a waterfall. Agile promised us that it was going to remove the testing squeeze. I don't know about y'all. I have yet to see that. So when it gets down to this testing squeeze, what do you cut first? Which test automation do you cut first? Which scripts do you cut first? What was the most important to test? What was tied to the business value? And without understanding that, and without having something like that in the strategy, you're left scrambling to try to figure out, what do we cut, right? Where do we look? Do we just cut everything? And oftentimes that's what winds up happening is they say, well, you can't prove that any of this is valuable. You can't prove that the trail you've been following is the right one. So let's just go ahead and remove it all, and we can worry about it later. So that's a really big problem when you have a lack of a testing strategy is, you're not prepared for that. You don't have the data to back it up. So with that all sounds great, right? We understand the problems that can go wrong. We all kind of understand, some of the mini fixes we can have in there. So let's really define what a test automation strategy actually is. Really simply put, it's a microcosm of your larger testing strategy. A lot of the same techniques that you will follow to develop and build a testing strategy will be the same for a test automation strategy. And we'll kind of go over some of those here in a little bit, but if you are in the position of maybe you don't have a testing strategy, so you don't have anything to pull that microcosm out of, you can follow a lot of these same types of rules and guidelines that we're going to set forward to help build that overall testing strategy. Because really what it all is, your test automation is simply a piece of your testing strategy that has all of these various, bits in here, your tools, types, performance, your quality criteria, and it sits on the same level as your other system testing, your NFR, your non-functional requirement testing, so your performance testing, where you're using a lot of the same data points to drive into the answer of what do we automate, how do we automate it, what technology makes the most sense, but you should be answering or have the ability to answer a lot of those same types of questions for your system testing and your product testing as well. So I really love this. And, this gives us a really kind of a good way to say, well, test automation strategy doesn't live outside of our larger test strategy. We really should kind of bring it in, use the same type of processes we are using to build the overall test strategy. If we don't have that, let's go ahead and start laying that groundwork of what tools do we need? What sort of personas do we have, right? Who essentially is, who are we testing for? What do our users do? What are our developers doing? Your elements, your quality criteria, your metrics, all those things, and similarly help drive your test automation strategy. So, we talked a little bit about what happens when you don't have an overall test strategy, as well as, obviously finding out that a test automation strategy is really just, a smaller piece of your larger test strategy. So why do we really care about a strategy for test automation then? So I believe it is the role of, quality professionals to inform. We inform on the risk, we inform on the capabilities, we inform on the functionality. And test automation is a very strong way to have a reliable, repeatable process to inform. As well as, strategy is a way to communicate, right? A lot of times we use strategies to communicate. We'll talk about here in a little bit, about what a strategy really is in terms of it. Is it a document? Is it, a PowerPoint? Is it, a diagram? We'll talk about that here in a minute. But each one of those has the ability to communicate what your goals are, what your plan is, and really what, your objective is for the reason why we're even doing test automation in the first place. Additionally, it kind of, building upon the communication piece, it provides a discussion starter to where you can say, hey, we would love to do this. Right, this we believe is a good idea. Here's the reasons why. Here's how it ties into the business, and allows you to essentially springboard onto potentially a proof of concept or the ability to develop or bring a new technology into the company. As well as quite frankly, coming from the financial technology sector as well as the healthcare sector, your test automation strategy, is, useful for audit purposes, right? Where you can kind of go back and look and say, hey, here's what we plan to do. And then you can compare it against what was actually done to make sure that we're following, the rule sets and the compliance rules and everything that we need to follow. So, those are not all encompassing about the reasons why we care, but we found, through the various mentoring sessions and working with these, technology professionals, that these are, really some of the key reasons why we're finding, organizations and individuals wanting to have a test automation strategy. So we mentioned here just a second ago, the ability to effectively communicate. And so we do get this question a lot in terms of, do we have to have a full on, 70-page Word document for our testing strategy? And the answer is definitely no. You can have a living document. It can be an idea that lives in a mind map. In fact, I love mind maps for test automation strategies. They work wonderfully and beautifully. So if you're not familiar with mind maps, highly recommend take a look at, what they are, how to use them. There's a lot of great YouTube tutorials on there, as well as, sketches where you can have essentially, I'm just going to sketch out some ideas, going to write some rough notes, and that could essentially develop into your testing strategy. So, the main takeaway here is that don't think of a testing strategy as I have to go in, I'm going to write this long, big document. Think about it of, hey, we can actually start with ideas and that's okay. And we can present that as a rough strategy to be able to then drive into your living and working document. So, it's just a great way to, kind of approach that of saying, you don't have to, boil the ocean or, as my wife and I love to watch Hometown a lot. And one of the phrases they have there when they're having to like redo real big houses is, how do you eat a whale? And the answer is one bite at a time. And this is much the exact same way, right? You have to have, a place to start, and it's okay to start small. That's totally fine. So let's talk about the actual steps to create your test automation strategy. We want to be able to have some actionable items that we could take away here. So, what are some things you can do, leaving this talk to help start creating your test automation strategy? So first is, gaining business alignment. If you've got the idea, you understand, kind of generally where you want to go, and you say, hey, we believe this is a good idea. Bump that up against what we like to call your high business value test. And what your high business value test essentially is, what is a flow that if it stopped working, it could potentially cause the business to fail. I like to use the example of Knight Capital. If you're a testing professional, you've never heard those words together or you understand the history of that company. It's essentially a company that went from a trading company, New York Stock Exchange. They went from, fully functional to belly up in 45 minutes, and they lost $480 million due to one software bug. So that obviously was a high business value test that was potentially not considered. And you look at, other types of scenarios where you say, okay, then maybe things like if you're an e-com site, it's checking out, it's creating an account, being able to view products. And make sure that you work with your business to understand what those high business value tests are, because it will allow you to say, is the solution that we're proposing, does that match the critical scenarios we have? And if the answer is no, maybe you need to go back to the drawing board. But if you don't have those conversations, you won't be able to say, we are providing business value with our automation framework, and that will allow you to also drive into your ROI conversation as well. Next is we want to, take those, that high business value, those test cases, along with the other, test cases that may be designed, or testing strategies or requirements, user stories, and identify, your risk. I am a big fan of risk-based approach to testing overall, and the same can be said for test automation. What is the impact, added to the probability that something is going to happen, that essentially allow you to define your risk. You can use your risk-based approach to say, hey, if we're developing this new solution, or we have a testing strategy, we need to figure out what to test first. We need to figure out how to have an answer to that testing squeeze. We can list out the risk, or the risk impacts to those test cases, to that test technology, to say, hey, these are the things we really should automate first. This is what makes the most sense. They're critical business flows. They're critical business items. And we should focus on those. And by having those defined in your test strategy, you'll not only be able to say, yes, what we're doing is important, but you'll also be able to say, hey, when it comes down to it, what would the impact be if we had to cut a week off of your testing cycle? Well, you could say, well, we wouldn't be able to get to these items, and several of them are high risk. So maybe we need to make some adjustments. Or you could say, I really don't recommend cutting a week off because we're going to miss out on these high risk items. So, having that risk-based approach is very, very important to helping to determine that priority, as well as to be able to answer that question of, when you get into that testing squeeze, what gets cut first. Next is, kind of understanding your technologies, your tools, your people, your platforms, your environments, right? Really kind of understanding, what is going on here when it comes to, your overall solution. How is the impact of your solution going to affect your environment, right? Do you have the proper accounts to run this? Do you have the proper, environmental access? Do you have the proper libraries and, APIs and various pieces that you may need to have your test automation solution talk to your application? A lot of times we see that people may need things like service accounts, or, tokens, or, keys to be able to communicate effectively with an application. So you want to be able to have that conversation of, okay, what do we need to make sure that this is working, instead of just having, hey, we've got this, automation framework, and it's just going to magically connect into and have a conversation with the application. There's a lot of times it doesn't work out that well. You need to have a good working solution that you can build in that is robust. So one of the big things I see where teams potentially fall down by not doing this is they build in, we'll use a very specific example in Selenium. They build in individual login logic to each one of their tests, or to even a smaller group of tests, instead of saying, hey, is there a way that we can have, some sort of, larger structure here where we could say, maybe we need to put this up and call that function of login that has all of the logic. It's got the keys, it's got the user, login information. So that way we only have to change it once. But if we don't plan for something like that up front, we're going to wind up having a lot of broken tests, a lot of fragile tests as well. So it's really important to kind of understand, what is your ecosystem? How are the people using it? What are the tools that might be required to implement that solution as well? This is one that I definitely see overlooked quite a bit, especially this last bullet point here of Retry Logic. I see a lot of automation frameworks that are very, very good, but then fail due to data failures. And a lot of times they say, well, a lot of times the data failure is maybe someone changed my data and I didn't know it, and so we failed it, and that entire script that was supposed to run overnight, or suite that's supposed to run overnight, it just failed. So what if you had the ability to say, identify if the data is correct with potentially another script in your automation framework, or run some pre-scripts to validate the data, or to load the data, and that could potentially save you hours and hours of rewriting fragile tests, or even having to rerun your tests. But if you don't think about that up front, and you don't put that into your strategy of how's the data stored, do we have to worry about masking or de-identifying data? Where are we getting it? Are we using an Excel sheet? Are we using a SQL database? What are we doing here? As well as having that retry logic you're going to find yourself, kind of going back and backhauling and, doing some rework on your framework architecture to try to figure out how that works. So really encourage you for, each release, each, big iteration of your framework to really take a look at how are we handling data? How does this work from an overall framework in terms of, do we need to have, separate libraries or functions that the tests call, or should, can the test individually handle this? So, just something to definitely keep in mind there. Next, then, this is definitely one that we're seeing, really come up and be very important and impactful to test automation teams in terms of, how do you kick your tests off? It used to be, I would write my scripts and it would kind of go into a black hole, and then, some results would populate and happen, and everyone would be, more often than not, kind of asking why the test failed instead of, happy and sunshine. But now we find that a lot of testers are able to, work directly with, Jenkins servers. They're able to work directly with, other, build and deploy tools, GitHub Actions, various, different types of things. And so if that's the case, you need to define that in your test automation strategy. Where is the code stored? So many times I still see that code is stored on laptops. It's not stored in a code repository. It doesn't have basic security scanning on it. It doesn't have basic code quality scanning on it. I mean, your test automation code is code, and it should be treated as such. So it really then falls into that DevSecOps pipeline of where is it stored? How are we building it? How are we deploying it? What environments is it running on? Are we scanning our own code? I have actually found major security flaws inside of, multiple automation frameworks to where ports were left open on, test boxes or test VMs, or the way that it was calling something, it was calling an external library that had malware built into it. So I'm sorry, it was calling an open source library that had malware built into it. So you need to be doing some level of security scanning, and you need to have a process for how that is done for your test automation framework as well. And then, again, as I mentioned here before, is, are the libraries you're using, is the open source code you're using secure? Again, it's one of the reasons why I, really like Katalon from our side. That it's secure, that it's, it's gone through its paces, that it's been tested. And, it's something that, works. But you don't necessarily have to worry about that. But, if you're using some, measure of libraries or open source code, highly recommend you take a look at how those are being used, as well as what scanning do you have in place. There's a lot of open source scanning tools. You don't have to pay for them if you're a small company, or if you're a larger company, hook into things like a Veracode or Source Code or SonarQube from that standpoint. Next is, we talked about this a little bit ago, but, really wanted to hit, as this is something that absolutely must be, its own section here, is what are your environmental considerations? Do you need, certain tokens? Do you need, VPNs? Do you need to have some sort of, launch box, or, a box that potentially sits outside of your network that launches your test into, Sauce Labs or whatever other browser tool you may have, or, kicking off Docker containers or images that potentially have, browser images or OS images? How does that work? Where does that live, right? Who's responsible for that? How is the patching done on those systems? Is it something that we spin up on demand? Are we using preemptible VMs? So, you want to make sure that you're documenting that, because it will really help you get your mind around that. And one of the biggest things that I see with this really helps with onboarding new testers to your organization. Because a lot of times what takes the longest is getting those access done, getting those, the VPN set up, getting the logins created. And a lot of times things are missed. And so they're left saying, well, my script is not running, but I really don't know why. It's saying, maybe I don't have access and I don't really know why it's not documented anywhere. So you really want to make sure that you truly understand where your code is running at all times. I have seen code accidentally run in production because there wasn't much, documented around that. And sometimes you really don't want to do that from a test automation standpoint. Sometimes it's okay, depending on where you work for. But you want to make sure that you really understand where that's happening and you have it documented. Very, very important to have that documented. This is one of my favorite ones. Absolutely. This has saved my bacon so many times. Having the ability to tag your tests and logically group them will allow you to say, it doesn't matter whether we have 20,000 or 50,000 test automation scripts. I know that these over here are for my checkout. I know that these over here are for my login. These are for smoke, certification, Sprint, whatever it might be. But if you don't have those tagged, then you're oftentimes left with, what do I run, right? Without having to look into the individual test script to say, what was this supposed to be doing? Which takes a lot of time. Trust me, it takes a lot of time. So if you don't have those tags, you're left doing all that groundwork trying to figure out. If you're, new to the organization, trying to figure out what is the purpose of a test. If you don't have those tags, you may not know. Someone says, hey, we need to run our smoke test. You're like, well, give me a few hours. I'll get back to you. Just need to comb through 20,000 tests. So one of the things that I highly recommend that you have up front in your test automation strategy is what we like to call a tagging agreement, to where you say, hey, instead of saying, cert, we're going to say certification. That way, when we run things, or maybe we want to kick off certain builds instead of Jenkins, you can actually pass parameters to say run all certification builds. But if you have someone over here labeling a C, someone over here labeling a cert, someone over here labeling a certification, you're going to have, essentially useless tags. So you need to have a tagging agreement that'll have your most common tags. Oftentimes I'll see these updated every release or every sprint in terms of now we're adding new functionality. So maybe, inbox V2 or, login V2 or password reset V2 or whatever it might be, or password reset new, however you want to document that. But you want to make sure that you really kind of understand that process up front, and really try to drive your team into using test tags. It's highly, highly beneficial. One of the next things as well that, we really find is, as you do this more often, as you get more mature, especially for, some of the kind of more nimble, right, organizations that have the ability to have a lot of unit tests, a lot of integration tests, you're able to say, well, we're running this same logic in a unit or integration test or a lower level API test. So why do I need to run the automation script, right? It's taking an extra minute. Maybe I can shave 30 of those tests off. It saves 30 minutes on my test run. So you have the ability to kind of understand that. If you understand what your goal is, where you're focusing on, what your tags are, you're able to say, maybe we can find some efficiencies where we don't have all this overlapping tests. But without that documented, a lot of times what we find is, the unit tests sometimes are doing the same thing that the manual testing, that is sometimes doing the same thing as the automation testing. And you have 3 people hitting the exact same test. Is it really necessary? More than likely not. But you can see if we reduce one, what is our impact? Do our defects go up? Does our time go down? Like where does that happen? So highly recommend you look for those efficiencies. Again, this is something that typically happens for teams that get a little bit more mature after following this process. But it was such an impactful thing for us that we wanted to put this in here because we have found significant time savings with really understanding your overall automation strategy, everything from that unit test all the way down to your UI test as well. So for those of you living in an agile world, Safe, Agile, Kanban, XP, whichever one you want to call it, I've got a couple of just little tips here. And for, those are my warriors, my waterfall warriors over here that are next, we have some considerations there for that next slide. So really for this one, one of the big things I'd like for you to really look at from an Agile standpoint is really try to embrace your Agile and DevOps tools. Work on your documentation. GitHub is a wonderful documentation repository as well. I absolutely love it for that. You can also, have, good, documentation in Jira, Confluence, Qtest. There's a lot of, good options you can use that are cloud-based, that easy to share, have, information that is easy to access, easy to locate. And then, what I could also consider for Agile as well is, your test strategy is going to turn more into a living document where potentially it's updated and reviewed each sprint. It's not necessarily going to be, this is the document we're going to use for the next year. And more so, hey, let's review it. And are we changing? Are we having to pivot a little bit? Are we staying with our visions and our goals? Are we keeping, our technology charter and our test agreement, our tagging agreement the same? So, definitely, look at those cloud tools and really try to embrace that living document. I found that it makes folks' lives a little bit easier from an Agile standpoint. Then from a waterfall standpoint, just because you have more time doesn't necessarily mean that you need a 150-page document. Repeat that for all of my waterfall warriors here, okay? Just because you have the time doesn't need to mean that you need to spend that time documenting everything. What you wind up with is you wind up with a big bloated document that nobody wants to read. It gets out of date very easily, and people are gone. And then the strategy is just forgotten about and it's not followed. And then the next thing you want to have is you want to have regular check-ins. We like to call these, micro strategy sessions, to where you're talking about, the various pieces of the strategy. You're kind of understanding, hey, are you still using the strategy? Hey, do we need to update anything? So having those regular check-ins instead of just, using the proverbial throw it over the wall type of mentality that does typically go with waterfall, you're really kind of still, almost having an agile-based approach at how you're working with a team and making sure that they are really following that and that, they truly understand it. So really, kind of wrapping some things up here, we want to make sure that you're focusing on your goals and communication and not your format. Don't get stuck in terms of what do I call this section? What do I need to put here for, this page? Does it need to be a 17-page document? And focus on the purpose of that you're trying to inform people on what your goals are in terms of test automation strategy and how are you going to deliver value. What is your overall technology goal? How is it affecting, the people in the organization? How is it affecting your environment? So that should be the number one thing that you think about when you go through this. Next is, as we talked about before, is, win the support of your business partners. If you have the support of your business partners, your product owners, your project managers, they're going to support you when it comes down to that testing squeeze of, yes, we trust you. We've seen the strategy. It's a very good strategy. And we know that you have a good grasp on what might need to be cut and what might not need to be cut. Next is, it's going to help you invest in the right technology. I've used test automation strategies when we have done, reviews of test automation frameworks, both freeware, open source, and paid for, and been able to determine the right answer because we're able to say which one of these matches most what we have in our test strategy. And then, next is using it as a basis for growth, right? If we know where we're coming from, we know potentially where we can grow to. So with that test strategy, you can say, hey, look at how far we've come. Look at how much we've automated. Look at how much we've changed, as well as, you kind of build in the foundation and the team to say, if we want to try something new, we can follow this awesome practice that we've implemented and allow us to grow into new technology or new areas. So, with that, definitely want to say big thanks to everyone. Really appreciate you, listening to this talk, having conversations as we go along. Definitely want to say thank you to the Pacific Northwest Software Quality Conference again. Really appreciate this opportunity, as well as my good friends over at Katalon. You can find some information here. Definitely check them out. Highly recommend them. I absolutely love the solution, and there's a great group of people as well. So lastly, feel free to reach out to me. Love making new friends. Love meeting new people. So definitely feel free to reach out. So, with that, stop sharing here, and would just like to say a final thank you so much. I hope you all have a wonderful conference, and hopefully we'll be able to meet face to face one day soon. Thank you so much.